sharing ocean acidification for communicators and educators. It's really great to have you all with us today. When I checked this morning, we had 231 people registered for this webinar from as far away as France, Germany, Mexico, Peru, and the Maldives, as well as many other places, including at least 23 states across the US. So there's a great amount of interest in this topic, and we're really excited to have you all here. And before we get started, we do just want to see who's on the line today. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll here. Here we go. So who's attending today? If you could just check the box for where you come from, what type of, whether you're an educator, scientist, government agency, that would help us know our audience a little bit better. Awesome. Another 10 seconds here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And so it looks like we've got about half of you are from a local, state, or federal agency, a third scientists, and almost a third informal educators, and then some others out there as well. So the title of today's presentation is Blue Carbon, the Climate Mitigation Opportunity You've Never Heard of. Hopefully some of you have heard of it, and you'll know a lot more about it after this webinar today. This webinar series is hosted by NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries and Ocean Acidification Program in collaboration with many others, including Washington Sea Grant, the Institute for Systems Biology. Our goal is to provide ocean acidification communication tools for formal and informal educators and stakeholders across the country and promote a more integrated and effective ocean acidification education community. I'm Laura Francis, Education Coordinator at the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and I'll be moderating today's session. We also have Jen Bennett-Mintz, Education and Outreach Coordinator for the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program online, who will be helping to answer questions from attendees. During the presentation, all attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you're welcome to type questions related to technical issues or questions for the presenter into the questions box at the bottom of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be monitoring incoming questions and we'll respond to them or pose them to our speaker. Also, we always welcome your input on what you'd like to see as a future source webinar and what topics and resources you would like to see covered. So if you have some ideas for us, please feel free to type them into the question box or provide them to us via email. And we'll take those into consideration as we plan for the future. So our speaker today, we're very excited to have Dr. Ariana Sutton-Grier, who's an ecosystem ecologist with expertise in wetland ecology and restoration, biodiversity, biogeochemistry, climate change, and ecosystem services. Ariana is a research faculty member at the University of Maryland in the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center, and also the Ecosystem Science Advisor for the National Ocean Service at NOAA. She holds a bachelor's degree from Oregon State University in Environmental Science and International Studies and has a doctoral degree from Duke University in Ecology. She leads the NOAA Coastal Blue Carbon Team as well as an interagency Blue Carbon group and is very involved with NOAA's efforts to support natural and nature-based coastal resilience strategies. She gets especially excited about seeking and discovering innovative opportunities to combine science and policy to solve environmental problems and promote ecosystem conservation. Her research has been published in many environmental and policy journals and featured in several news stories, as well as a children's science TV show. So welcome, Ariana. I'll go ahead and change the presenter over to you, and you can get started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. And I think before we go any farther on my topic today of blue carbon, which I am really excited to share with all of you, we were going to do one more poll question. Is that right, Laura?
Yeah, I can put that one up right now.
Perfect.
So everyone should see a quick poll on the screen. Which of the following habitats sequester carbon for the long term? So go ahead and choose your answer there. Give it another 10 seconds or so. We've got 70% voted so far. All right, don't be shy. Go ahead and put your vote in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I'll close the poll. And should be able, can you see those results, Ariana?
I can't seem to see them. I wasn't sure how that was going to work.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read them to you. We've got 3% say forest, and 13% say coastal wetlands, 2% say corals, 52% say A, B, and C, and 30% say A and B only.
All right. Well, that is a great place to start as we head into the talk today, and hopefully by the end, you guys will have figured out exactly what the answer is. I'll try to clarify it, though, if it isn't clear. That's very helpful to me, though. So I want to begin by just making sure we all know what we are talking about when we say coastal blue carbon or coastal wetland blue carbon. So green carbon is the carbon taken up and stored by plants in terrestrial ecosystems. It can also be stored in the soils, but it's taken up by plants. Black carbon is the carbon that is emitted either through the production or the burning of fossil fuels or by forest fires and other fires on the landscape. Blue carbon then is the carbon taken up and stored in coastal and ocean systems. And what we're going to talk about today is that coastal wetland blue carbon fraction, which is the carbon taken up and stored long-term in coastal habitats. And here we're particularly talking about salt marshes, or maybe more broadly tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. So these ecosystems are shown here on the map. Green is seagrass, yellow is salt marsh, and orange is mangrove. And what one can see when looking at the world is that these blue carbon ecosystems exist practically all over the world when you combine all three of them. So they are very much globally distributed. And we have, in recent years, begun to fully understand how much carbon these ecosystems are actually sequestering. So what you see here on the is a graph, and on the y-axis is carbon burial rate in the soils, and then you see compared 3 forested systems to our 3 coastal wetland systems. And note the log scale on the y-axis. And so what this means is that these systems are actually burying or sequestering over 10 times as much carbon on a per area basis than our forested systems when we compare them. So that's, again, per area. So even though these coastal systems are a much smaller total area, they actually, because of their greater rates of sequestration, they actually are a relatively equivalent annual sink to our forested systems. So now if you think about this carbon going into these ecosystems kind of like a bank account, this is like your monthly or your yearly deposit of your income. This is the carbon flowing in or the money flowing into the system. So then the next question is, what's already in your savings account in this bank? This carbon bank we're talking about. And so it turns out that these coastal habitats are also really impressive storers of carbon. And so what you're seeing here is a graphic, and the brown is the carbon stored in soils. The green is carbon stored in biomass. And so I want to direct your attention first to that last line, the tropical forest. And what you see here is that the majority of the carbon is stored in the living biomass, in the trees, in the wood, but some of it is stored in the soil. Then if you compare that to your coastal systems above, there's several things to note. First, many of those coastal systems actually store more carbon per area than the tropical forest system. And this is actually probably a fairly conservative estimate for these coastal systems because this is only the top meter of soil shown here. And many of these coastal systems are several meters deep. And so that's a lot of old carbon that goes much deeper than what we're even seeing here. Another interesting point is that for these coastal systems, the majority of the carbon that is stored is not in the biomass. It's not in the green fraction. It's in the brown fraction. And why I think that's particularly important is that unlike in forests where we see the carbon, we see the trees, we see the wood, we don't see a lot of the carbon stored in these coastal systems because it's below ground. And I think that's one of the reasons why these systems, these ecosystems, are coming onto the climate mitigation discussion forums a little bit later than forests, which we've already been talking about for several years as important carbon sinks. And then so the other thing to recognize about that soil carbon is most of that soil carbon is actually fairly old. It tends to be decades, if not hundreds or even thousands of years old, the farther down in the soil profile you go. So we're talking about very old carbon that's been accumulating in these systems for a very long time. Okay, well, so why does that matter? Well, that matters because these coastal ecosystems are some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. And we are rapidly losing them. So global rates of loss range between 0.7 and 7% annually for these ecosystems. And what's really an additional problem is that when we lose these ecosystems, when they're degraded, when they are drained, when they become things like aquaculture ponds or coastal development, instead of being wetlands, these impressive carbon sinks become very important additional anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gases. One estimate suggests that the destruction of coastal ecosystems every year adds an additional between 3 and 19% of our annual emissions of those of deforestation. So this is an additional anthropogenic emission from landscape conversion. And so here at NOAA, I've been working for the past several years really trying to think about, all right, what are the opportunities for now that we better understand this important service provided by these systems, this carbon sink? What are the opportunities for leveraging this important service either in climate mitigation or adaptation or coastal conservation policy opportunities? And so that's what I want to talk a little bit more about today. So one of the first questions that came to me from NOAA leadership was, well, what are we doing? Where is blue carbon included in our policies, or is it included? Or if it's not, could it be? And so a small team of us examined where coastal blue carbon could be included. We looked at laws such as the Clean Water Act or the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Process, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. And what we determined was that carbon services are not currently included in the implementation of most of these policies, but they probably should be, and they could be. The language and the way these laws are written or these regulations are written suggests that we could be incorporating carbon services, but it would change the way we currently implement these laws. Now, another important fact we determined was that if you were to incorporate the carbon services of these ecosystems into the implementation of these policies, it could lead to more habitat conservation and climate mitigation. And I want to give an example of that. So for example, when we do a Clean Water Act mitigation, so a project's going to impact a wetland and we say, all right, we're going to mitigate the loss of that wetland. Typically, when we figure out how much habitat we have to restore or create in order to mitigate that loss, we focus on living resources. So we figure out how many hectares of plant biomass are we going to lose? How many birds' nests or turtle nests or other animal features are we going to lose? And then we figure out how much habitat we need to restore elsewhere to try to offset that loss. The issue is that because we're not incorporating soil resources into that calculation, if we've got hundreds or thousands of years worth of carbon buried in those soils that's potentially going to then get emitted when that site is impacted, we are not typically defining our mitigation ratios to include that. So a mitigation ratio might be 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, maybe 5 to 1. But if we're going to try to mitigate 1,000 years worth of carbon, we might need mitigation ratios that are 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 or even larger. And so that's what I mean by if we were to incorporate the soil into these policies, the way we implement these policies, we might actually have more conservation and more climate mitigation. So one of my colleagues and I decided to try to take this from the hypothetical of we could do this to more of a where could we do this and could we set some precedents by trying to do this. And we have done that in 2 different NEPA related documents. So one was a Sears Point NEPA environmental assessment, and this was a restoration project happening out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we were able to incorporate in that environmental assessment an understanding of what the climate mitigation benefits of the 2 different restoration scenarios they were assessing would be, so that could be part of the decision-making context of which restoration did they want to go with. And that's been finalized. So that's out there. It's part of that particular NEPA environmental assessment. In doing that, I was working with folks in the Restoration Center here in NOAA, and they said at the same time, wow, we're redoing our programmatic environmental impact statement, which is the document that guides all of our restoration projects here. And we think you should put language into that document that suggests that carbon services should be part of our restoration process in the future. So we did. We incorporated language into that document as well, which has been finalized and is available online. And that doesn't say you have to do carbon in every restoration project. It basically says you should consider whether carbon should be a part of your decision-making process. And because for some projects, it may or may not be a critical piece. So really that's setting the stage for the ability to, in the future, be incorporating carbon into our decision-making process related to NEPA and related to doing restoration projects. So that was really exciting progress forward. At the same time that NOAA's been working on this, there's been some movement at the U.S. federal level as well. And in the fall of 2014, the priority agenda for enhancing the climate resilience of America's natural resources was released by the Office of the President. And part of that document, I don't expect you to read all of this, but if you focus on the orange box, part of that document specifically says we need to manage and enhance U.S. carbon sinks. And this was a really great step forward because in the initial framing of this document, this piece about managing and enhancing U.S. carbon sinks wasn't even part of it. So that was already a big win to kind of broaden the discussion to include proper management of our current carbon sinks. In addition, in the small print, which you don't have to read, but it's there, it says we need to focus on conserving and restoring soils, and then if you look farther, wetlands and coastal areas that store carbon. So the discussion moved beyond forests to include grasslands and wetlands and coastal areas. So that was a big step forward, and it was really exciting that that made it in there. And we actually had a particular activity out of that, which I'm going to come back to. So it was in the priority agenda that there would be a blue carbon activity that we needed to complete. So at the same time that all of this is happening in the U.S., internationally things are moving forward too. So in 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released their international policy, the IPCC 2013 Wetlands Supplement. So previous greenhouse gas guidance to countries that was supposed to inform the national inventories that all countries put forward to the IPCC, that previous guidance did not include wetlands or soils very effectively. And the reason for that was that there basically it wasn't considered we had enough data yet to do that in 2006. Well, by 2013, a lot more data had been published on the importance of these systems for both emissions and as carbon sinks. And so the 2013 supplement provides parties with the guidance, parties meaning countries, on how to include emissions from wetlands in their inventories. Now, just to be clear, this is currently not a requirement. Countries do not have to do this yet, but they are encouraged to be gaining experience in implementing these new guidelines so that they can report back in 2017 on how that went. And the U.S. is actually trying to do this right now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But my hope is that this guidance will eventually become more of a requirement once they work out whatever kinks they want to in the guidance. And this will mean that blue carbon ecosystems hopefully will included in future inventories for countries all around the world, which means both the emissions from the loss of those systems, but also their important sink capabilities would be included. Okay, so I said the U.S. was really interested in actually trying this, and this is where the White House Priority Agenda comes back in, because the action in the White House Priority Agenda said that we would, in the U.S., do a baseline assessment of the carbon in our coastal systems. And so that is what we are doing. This is a NOAA-led effort, but we're partnering with Restore America's Estuaries and the Environmental Protection Agency and other U.S. government agencies as well as academics. We are currently using the IPCC guidelines, and we're going to do a minimum of a Tier 1 assessment. By Tier 1, I mean the most basic kind of assessment that we can do, but in some places we have enough data to make it more regionally specific. So we'll do a Tier 1. I don't know that we're going to get all the way to a Tier 3, which is where you model or measure every piece of your greenhouse gas inventory. I think we're going to probably be at a mix of Tier 1 and Tier 2. And so we're also busy identifying what are the research gaps and needs if we wanted to take this to the next level. And so basically we reported on this initial progress at COP21 in Paris in December. There was a lot of interest in the fact that the U.S. was doing this and how we were doing it. And our first estimates of coastal carbon will be in the inventory by 2017. So that'll be the 2016 inventory that gets submitted next spring of 2017. So this is very exciting progress forward that is both national in scale, but also clearly relates to that international context. Now, I want to mention a regional effort that I find really exciting at the same time as well. And this is California's AB 32, which was passed in 2006. It was called the Global Warming Solutions Act, and they basically committed to being at 1990 emissions levels by 2020. Now, California is using a variety of approaches to get there, to get to this reduction target for their emissions, and they're including policies and regulations, but also market-based approaches. And so they have a cap and trade program that they've set up, and it began in 2012, that allows those who need to buy offsets can offset 8% of their compliance requirements using offsets. Now, current offsets that are available that relate to land use are forestry, dairy digesters, and then destruction of ozone-depleting substances. And the proceeds from this market go into what's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Well, so where this relates to wetlands is that some of the money from that Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, they have decided, and they first funded this in spring of 2015, they decided to invest some of it into coastal wetland restoration projects. There are 12 projects that are wetland projects, 4 of them are coastal, and these, including the Elkhorn Slough, which you see pictured here. And this is basically an effort to see what kind of restoration efforts can potentially have really interesting greenhouse gas emissions reductions associated with them. The idea, of course, in the future might be that you might be able to have a wetland offset as well, even though that's currently not possible. But even if they never do a wetland offset, the fact that they're funding wetland restoration is really exciting. So this is clearly still in development. Those 12 projects just started to get implemented this past year. We're still watching what happens, but this is a really exciting regional policy opportunity. Now, in addition, I wanted to mention some of the market side of things. So in the U.S., we don't have a full national compliance market, but we do have, as I just mentioned, that compliance market in California, and there's RGGI up in the Northeast, but we don't have a national scale one. So when we're talking nationally, we have to be talking about the voluntary market. And NOAA has partnered with Restore America's estuaries to really identify opportunities for wetland restoration that might be able to be possible to be part of the voluntary carbon markets. And so in order to do that, we helped develop the VCS methodology, which would allow carbon credits for wetland restoration projects, and that includes seagrasses, and that's for projects anywhere around the world. It does not have to be a project here in the U.S. The VCS works on projects anywhere in the world. So this methodology was approved the end of November last year. It was very exciting. You can get the methodology at that particular link. And this basically now means that a wetland restoration project anywhere in the world can seek carbon credits through the voluntary market. And again, that's seagrasses or any other kind of tidal wetland restoration. So that is incredibly exciting as progress forward. And now we're hoping to see basically demo projects that implement the methodology so we can test it out and see how it works. In addition, working with Ray, NOAA and Ray have worked on some landscape assessments of the restoration potential of watersheds or estuaries. So the first of those was an assessment of the Snohomish Estuary in Washington State, where Ray found that full watershed restoration would lead to the sequestration of 8.4 million tons of CO2 over a 100-year time frame, and that's about the equivalent of 1 year of emissions from 1.6 million passenger cars, so it's not a small amount of greenhouse gas reduction. They're currently in the process of doing a similar type assessment in Tampa Bay, which will be available hopefully by this summer. Tampa Bay is a neat site because they have all 3 ecosystems there, seagrass, mangroves, and marshes, to be looking at and looking at full restoration of the Tampa Bay watershed. So that's progress on the sort of market side of things. How could we be valuing this service in a market framework? Now, through all of the efforts I've been mentioning, there are science needs that are needed to support these policy movements forward. One thing we really need are better regionally specific estimates of both sequestration and storage, as well as emissions when salt marsh mangroves and seagrasses are degraded in particular. And then in addition, we surprisingly do not have the best maps of seagrass extent in the U.S., and this is actually a problem globally. And we don't even have full coverage of our salt marsh extent, particularly globally. So we need better maps to understand what do we currently have, and then what are we potentially losing. We also really need to better understand the emissions from degraded coastal ecosystems, and this includes the fate of carbon in drowned wetlands. And drowned wetlands are those that are unable to keep pace with sea level rise, either because they're being starved of sediment, or there's nutrient pollution that's causing higher rates of decomposition, or because there's other factors affecting the wetland, such as pumping of aquifers or oil causing subsidence. For whatever reason, you have wetlands that are drowning and unable to keep up with sea level rise, and we do not fully understand what happens to the carbon that's already buried in those systems. And it probably really varies depending on whether you're a high wave environment or a low wave environment, and some of the other geomorphological characteristics of the site, and we need a much better understanding of that in order to better estimate what kind of emissions we're likely to have as we continue to lose wetlands into the future. So one of the things I love about coastal blue carbon is that I'm talking a lot about the carbon today, but it really isn't all about the carbon. What's great about these systems, these important natural carbon sinks, is that they provide a whole host of other ecosystem services, co-benefits, if you will. And examples of those kinds of co-benefits are things like they provide protection from storms and erosion. They provide important support as fishery habitat. They are also some of the ecosystems we love to go recreate in, and so they really are important sources of tourism in many places. And they provide water filtration and habitat for other species, etc. So I want to go back to that first one, though, protection from storms and erosion, because I think there's a really great intersection with what is being called natural infrastructure or hybrid infrastructure in some cases. Because right now, post-Hurricane Sandy, there's a huge growing interest in the role of natural or green infrastructure to improve coastal resilience of communities. And so when we're talking about natural infrastructure, what we mean is using ecosystems or a combination of ecosystems and built features, which is usually called hybrid infrastructure, for example, for storm and erosion protection. And so when we're talking about this, this includes things like marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, but it also includes other ecosystems like reefs, beaches, dunes, and barrier islands. So I want to give an example of what we mean when we say a hybrid example or a hybrid infrastructure, and that's living shorelines. So living shorelines use a combination of habitat restoration and built features to provide protection from erosion and storms. And what you're seeing in the top picture here is a beach that was eroding. This is on a piece of NOAA property in North Carolina at Pivers Island. And you see it before construction in the top, and then you see it after the living shoreline was constructed in the bottom. And you have a narrow fringing marsh, and then it's a little hard to see, but they used oyster shell from the site to create a sill along the edge of the marsh that's completely made out of oyster shell, and it has actually become a small restored oyster reef. So these living shorelines provide many of the benefits of natural ecosystems, and in the case of living shorelines with marshes, this also means that it's actually a carbon sink. And there was a recent publication by Davis et al. That basically quantified how much carbon is really being sequestered in these sites. And so when they looked at the blue carbon benefits, there were two pieces to this. The first is that if you've got soils that have carbon in them and you put in a living shoreline to stop erosion, you are stopping the erosion of the soil carbon, and the carbon stays buried. So basically you're avoiding an emission that otherwise likely would have gone out into the ocean and become decomposed, and you would have released more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So you keep the carbon buried. That's one benefit. But in addition, this marsh starts to grow and basically starts to do what marshes do, which is to build up carbon in the soils. And the Davis et al. Publication found that on average, these sites were doing 70 to 80 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And so even though this is a very narrow marsh, the point of the paper was if we do a whole bunch of these projects, if we really start to focus on climate change and coastal resilience to things like sea level rise, which so many communities are starting to experience in very serious ways, then there actually become climate mitigation benefits of that whole slew of additional climate resilience or adaptation projects, which I think is really exciting and again gets at that co-benefit piece. So I really think it's important for the blue carbon community to think about and capitalize on any interest in green and hybrid infrastructure, or if there are other services that really start to have an important interest in coastal communities, we can capitalize on those co-benefits to promote coastal restoration and protection projects that end up having mitigation benefits as well as adaptation and conservation benefits. So one of the things I was asked specifically to talk about to this group, because some of you focus on education, was more thinking on, well, what are some of the challenges with communicating about coastal blue carbon, or how can we do it well? And so when we are thinking about communicating about coastal blue carbon, I think that there are really important two important points we need to make. The first is that coastal wetlands are this important natural sink. And so what you see in the figure here is the green arrows are carbon being taken up by the plants, and then the red arrow is some of that carbon being sequestered into the soil where it stays for a very long time. So you get long-term sequestration in these ecosystems. Now, what I also mentioned, when you degrade these systems, then they become a source, an additional anthropogenic source of greenhouse gases. And so these are some of the main points that need to be made when communicating about coastal blue carbon. But what tends to happen is I tend to get questions at presentations about, well, what about other coastal ecosystems? So before I go any farther, Laura, I wanted to ask if you could put up the next poll question.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. We just had a couple questions that have come in kind of early on in your presentation. I wanted to see if I could pose those to you now before I do the poll.
Okay.
So one of them was, can you clarify what oceanic mangroves are?
I'm sorry, oceanic what? You cut out.
Oh, oceanic mangroves.
Oh, yeah, sure. So you have mangroves that are further up in estuaries, and then you have ones that are right on the coastal fringe, right at the edge. So some of them are getting a lot more wave action than others. But basically, you have mangroves that in tropical areas can sort of be all along the estuary. So it's a little bit like having a salt marsh all the way up to a tidally influenced freshwater marsh. They go inland a ways as well.
Okay, and then one other question that came through in the slide discussing carbon storage in living biomass versus sediment. How do these numbers compare to what's stored in permafrost? And the comment was permafrost is an important long-term storage carbon sink, and is there concern that it will become a carbon source?
Yeah, there is absolutely a huge concern about permafrost. Permafrost represents one of the largest natural carbon sinks on the planet, and it's also been accruing in the soils there for long periods of time. And as we have warming of the climate, and particularly we're seeing warming in the polar regions, that's more extreme than in the more temperate and tropical areas. And so we're seeing massive changes that are affecting permafrost. And there's actually a really big concern that as you warm that permafrost, you're going to unlock mechanisms of decomposition that have been locked up because it's been so cold and frozen. They've been locked up for hundreds or thousands of years, and we're going to unleash that all at once. And that is very frightening. One of the things I think is most frightening about that is that it's very hard to manage that. If this is something that is happening because of global changes in the climate, it's very hard to slow that process down once it gets started. We're going to hit some kind of a tipping point, a threshold, and it's going to be very hard to back away from that. The interesting thing about coastal blue carbon in comparison to permafrost is that we absolutely know exactly what we're doing in these systems that is causing the emissions, and it's all having to do with human activities typically. And so it's very controllable, it's very manageable if we make changes immediately to the way we are treating our coastal ecosystems. And if we do more protection and in many cases more restoration of those systems, because we've already lost so many of them around the planet. So I don't work on permafrost right now. It definitely is a very important potential source of additional greenhouse gases. But I think the hardest part is what can we be doing to stop the permafrost loss? There is potentially that's a potentially much harder problem than what is actually a more manageable problem, in my opinion, along our coasts.
Great, thank you. And I'll go ahead and launch that poll right now. So which of these ecosystems sequesters carbon long term? We'll leave the poll open for another 30 seconds or so. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we've got about 75% have voted, and I'll go ahead and share that.
Perfect.
So, Ariana, if you can't see it, 51% said corals, 22% kelp, 20% phytoplankton, and 7% marine animals such as fish.
Okay. Great. That is probably a very typical split between these ecosystems. And when we're talking about communicating about blue carbon, as I said, I tend to get questions related to, well, why are you only talking about mangrove, seagrasses, and salt marsh or tidal marshes? Why not other ecosystems? And I want to address that head on right now. And actually, I have a publication in review that is going to help address this because it's a very common question. So let's tackle corals first. So what about corals? Aren't they also sequestering carbon? And the answer actually is, if you look in this figure, so remember the green arrows represent when carbon is being taken up. And so in corals, you have carbon taken up by the algal symbionts that are in the corals. But most of that carbon is actually released then through respiration and decomposition. So you basically have the corals taking the photosynthesis happening in the corals, but most of that's just being used to maintain the corals in their daily growth and just their daily maintenance. It's kind of like the food we eat, right? It goes in, but it doesn't necessarily stay in because we burn it off to maintain our bodies. Well, so the other green arrow you see in this figure is actually the process of carbon dissolution of corals, dissolution of calcium carbonate. That process actually takes up CO2. And so that is a sink for carbon. Calcification, so the formation of shells, which is the equation right above that, is actually not a sink for carbon. The process actually releases CO2 to the atmosphere when you are forming calcium carbonate in shells. So what that means is that a healthy coral reef is actually a small source of CO2 to the atmosphere instead of being a sink. And so the science really suggests that healthy corals are not a sink and therefore really probably shouldn't be part of our climate mitigation discussions. They have everything to do with our climate adaptation discussions because these ecosystems provide important storm and erosional protection and actually often are protecting other blue carbon ecosystems like mangroves or seagrasses. So I'm definitely not saying they're not important, but interestingly, they are not a carbon sink. The only way they become a carbon sink is if we have a lot more dissolution of reefs, which then means we're losing our reefs, which none of us are probably interested in. So there's the answer on corals. Moving on then to, well, what about kelp? I get asked that too. So again, let's do the color coding in the arrows. You don't see any red arrows in this figure either, and red was where we get that long-term sequestration. So what kelp does is a lot of carbon uptake by photosynthesis. But kelp doesn't tend to, some of it's free-floating and some of it survives on very rocky shorelines, but it doesn't develop sediment with strong rooting systems the way those other coastal ecosystems do. It tends to just barely be attached to those rocky areas, and it doesn't develop that soil portion of the storage. So the only carbon in kelp then is in the biomass, which tends to be very easily decomposed. And so basically what the scientific evidence suggests is that there's really not a large fraction, if any, that gets buried into long-term ocean sediments where it actually could be a sink where it's sequestered for a long period of time. So kelp are, again, a very important part of the carbon cycling in oceans, and they are clearly very important at supporting the marine food web, but they are not providing long-term carbon storage. So then I often also get asked the same question about phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, here we do see a red arrow, right? So phytoplankton, again, are taking up carbon, but they're photosynthesizing, and some of it is sinking all the way to the ocean floor and making its way into soils so that there is long-term carbon sequestration. The hard part about phytoplankton is that even though there is this huge short-term carbon sink in the ocean and still an actually quite impressive amount of sequestration, this sequestration is spread over the entire ocean floor, making it very hard to think about managing it, not to mention the fact that phytoplankton tend to be very stable. Our best estimates are that the amount of phytoplankton at any one point is fairly stable. And basically the only thinking on how we might modify this or might manage if we wanted more climate change benefits, this is one of the strategies considered for geoengineering. where we talk about doing iron fertilization of the oceans so that they would take up more carbon. The issue is that there's not a lot of evidence suggesting that that's particularly effective, meaning if we fertilize with iron, do we really get more phytoplankton biomass, and does it stay for long enough that we actually have impacts on that long-term sequestration? Because again, it's that long-term sequestration we're looking for in terms of having important climate benefits. And then the other issue, of course, is it's a jurisdictional issue. Who manages this sink? Who gets to control it? Most of it's in international waters, and it gets very tricky if you want to try and modify that particular sink, because there's a lot of concerns that there's more harm done to marine ecosystems if we do something like iron fertilization than there are benefits. So phytoplankton is a long-term sink, but very hard to potentially think about in terms of our current climate mitigation frameworks and strategies. So there's your answer. This was the ecosystem that does sequester carbon long term. The answer is phytoplankton does, but should it be part of our climate mitigation framework? The answer is at this point it still would be very hard to include it for many reasons. And then the last ecosystem is the marine fauna piece. And this one, basically, you see there's not even a lot of green arrows here, and that's because it's phytoplankton typically taking up the CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then that phytoplankton gets eaten by all the other critters. And so those critters are all important carbon pools, and they are an important part of the carbon cycle of the ocean, of course, but they are not sequestering carbon long term. And so again, they really aren't probably a good, they really shouldn't be part of our climate mitigation policy framework and our discussions, because they just aren't a piece of the long-term sequestration puzzle. And of course, a lot of these organisms move around. So again, we have that policy issue of who would own them, who would try to be controlling them, who would be either reaping the benefits or actually being targeted if there was some kind of negative change. That gets very complicated. So basically, that leaves us back with coastal wetland blue carbon. So there are important both scientific and policy reasons why, when we talk about coastal blue carbon, coastal wetland blue carbon, we are focusing on those wetlands. We're focusing on tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses only. And that's because not only are they important sinks for carbon, basically we can manage them, and we have actually really good ideas of how to manage them better for their climate mitigation benefits. And I think as we keep trying to talk about things like kelp or corals, it really just muddies the discussion and makes it harder to make any progress on the three that make sense to have as part of our climate mitigation discussions. Okay, I know we're running out of time. I wanted to mention really briefly something about citizen science, because I was also asked to talk about citizen science, and I find it really exciting that in some of the projects around the world that are blue carbon projects, they're really involving the local community. So this is a mangrove restoration project in Kenya, the Makoko Pamoja project, and they are involving locals in the planting of the mangroves for restoration and also in the monitoring of the system. Here you see a woman measuring the growth of a mangrove. And it's very exciting because they've also built this boardwalk through the mangrove system, and it's providing a source of alternative livelihoods via ecotourism. A lot of the women are actually giving tours of the mangrove system and talking about the restoration, and that's a whole new, brand new alternative livelihood for them, which is really exciting. And then another example in India, in the Sundarbans area, this is another mangrove restoration project. It's a huge project where they're looking to restore 6,000 hectares. And they are involving, again, a lot of the local community and particularly women in the growing and the planting of the mangroves that they're restoring. So this is a really exciting opportunity for them to have alternative livelihoods with obvious climate mitigation benefits, but also coastal resilience benefits and community benefits. So I think those are really exciting examples of citizens involved in these projects. I was also asked to talk about, okay, so what are the links between blue carbon and ocean acidification? And the first one is really the big picture that any greenhouse gas sink is good for reducing ocean acidification, because the more CO2 we pull out of the atmosphere, the less goes into the ocean, and that's good for ocean acidification. So blue carbon is good from that standpoint. But it's interesting because there's also some evidence that seagrasses in particular can act as ocean acidification refugia for species either at key points in their lifetime or for species that are nearby seagrasses. And so, for example, in Washington State, they're really looking into this because they have a very important shellfish industry there. And one of their goals in their action plan was to look at vegetation-based remediation. And they have one experiment that has also already shown that eelgrass can raise the pH of the ocean water by 0.5 units. And remember, pH is on a log scale, so 0.5 units is actually a fair amount. And that this reduction that happens during the day, because the seagrass is photosynthesizing and drawing CO2 out of the water, then actually does last somewhat through the night, and then starts again with pickup of photosynthesis in the next day. So now they're really looking at, is this a larval refuge in these seagrasses that are near the shellfish? And they're looking to continue measurements. They're going to start measurements of clam growth inside and outside eelgrass beds to see if they can see if growth really is affected. And they're also beginning projects to test kelp and seaweed as other ways that you might be able to draw down CO2 and act again as a local remediation effort for ocean acidification. So I think there's really neat parallels between blue carbon and ocean acidification. So then I want to just close by saying, I really see coastal wetland blue carbon as a triple win here, where you have climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and obviously conservation co-benefits that we talked about today. But it is important to remember that there really is no silver bullet when it comes to climate change mitigation. So I'm definitely not suggesting that blue carbon is the only answer. I do see it, however, as part of the solution that we need to be implementing, we being humans on the planet right now, because it has so many additional benefits and is a really important way to be limiting any additional anthropogenic sources through limiting destruction of these systems. And then if we restore them, we gain back a sink that we had previously lost. So I really see it as an important piece of the climate mitigation challenge. And I hope that, given what I've talked about today, that if you hadn't ever heard about it or if you didn't know a lot about it, what you'll do now is go out and tell all your friends and your neighbors, and the next party you're at, you'll talk about, hey, I heard about this cool thing called coastal blue carbon, and tell your friends about it, because the more we all understand this, the more we can make better decisions about how we manage these coastal systems and hopefully protect and restore more of them. And with that, I'm happy to take additional questions, and please feel free to email me. My website is there, and here's some resources that are available to you. But yeah, definitely feel free to email me if there's more that you want to talk about and we don't get to it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And we do have many, many questions rolling in, and I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but I'll go ahead and start sending them over to you, and we can see how far we get here. And just a note to the audience, we'll be able to pose these questions to Ariana, and she can get back to us with email, and we'll be able to get your questions answered eventually, just maybe not all live on air here. So we will get all the questions to Ariana to get back to you. So the question is there any consideration for sea level rise and degraded wetlands? Perhaps planning should include wetlands moving inland to higher ground? That's a question.
Yes, absolutely. So we call it coastal squeeze, and that's what happens when we have built structures that don't allow ecosystems to move inland, but that is one of the responses, the natural responses to sea level rise, is that an ecosystem can move inland. And in lots of places, we have really armored our shorelines, and we've made it very difficult for marshes or mangroves to move inland, and that's what we call coastal squeeze. Now, that said, that's not the only way that these ecosystems can combat sea level rise. Most of these ecosystems have actually been accreting soil for thousands of years, or hundreds at least, but thousands in many cases. And as a result, that's why they have those meters and meters of really organic, rich soil storing all that carbon, because one of the ways these ecosystems keep up with sea level rise is to accrete that soil. They typically are accreting between 2 and 3 millimeters a year. In some places a lot more than that. It does depend somewhat on sediment supply as well as the organic matter inputs. Some wetlands are almost exclusively organic in terms of the material heading into the soil. Some of them actually rely a lot on sediment sources that are coming from other places on the landscape and ending up in the wetlands. That's part of what's challenging some of our Gulf wetlands right now, is that with the channeling of the Mississippi, we have fed a lot of that sediment that used to go into our coastal wetlands. Now it heads straight out into the ocean and doesn't make it into those wetlands, and they are being starved of the ability to then keep pace with sea level rise, and you have a lot of wetlands drowning because they don't have that sediment source. So, but my point is that these systems don't just have to move inland with sea level rise, but that is an option, particularly if sea level rise rates increase. And so if we have faster rates of sea level rise, then you could see movement inland, but only if we haven't built something inland that's preventing them from moving inland. And in a lot of places, we have that coastal squeeze phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. And another question here is, what does dam removal on river systems mean for blue carbon? Is sediment built up and then released?
Yeah, absolutely. So that again relates to what I was just saying. Dam removal can be really great for coastal wetlands in that if the dams have been holding back sediment, which basically all dams do, then that sediment that otherwise would have been moving downstream, and some of that likely would have ended up in coastal wetlands. Wetlands are actually very efficient at trapping sediments. The water slows down as it hits the vegetated systems, and a lot of that sediment settles out and gets trapped on the wetland instead of going out into the coast. And the difference in terms of carbon and climate is that sediment that just makes its way out into the coast, some of that may settle to the deep ocean and get buried, but a lot of it gets remineralized and decomposed in the water column, and basically carbon ends up back in the atmosphere. Whereas if it settles out on a wetland and gets buried in the soil, that's what will stay for hundreds or thousands of years. So dam removal could be very beneficial for keeping wetlands afloat, essentially, keeping them, helping them keep pace with sea level rise, and it could actually mean that then if it's trapped in wetlands, instead of making its way out into the ocean, it will actually be held in a sink for a much longer time period.
Great. This is a bit of a longer question, so bear with me. It says, you mentioned wetlands a lot, but the person asking the question said they're under the impression that of wetland habitats, only tidal salt marshes were able to provide carbon benefits. Other coastal marshes that are not tidally influenced seem to be cited as sources of global greenhouse gases. So where do we draw this line? For example, if something's acting as a source of methane or other global greenhouse gases, but burying organic carbon at the same time, is it still worth restoring from a carbon standpoint?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So when we first started our efforts here at NOAA on coastal blue carbon, we were focused primarily on salt marshes, but mangroves and seagrasses too. Those three ecosystems have all been shown to be important sinks of greenhouse gases with climate mitigation benefits. The question is really about, what about freshwater wetlands? And so the difference between salt marsh and, say, freshwater tidal marsh or brackish marsh is that you have a lot more sulfate in salt marshes from the ocean water. You have sulfate just in ocean water. And when you have sulfate present, the microbes that reduce sulfate are actually capable of outcompeting the microbes that would otherwise be producing methane, which is a greenhouse gas with at least 25 times the radiative forcing power of CO2. So it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. And basically, so in those salt marsh systems, we know for sure that very little methane, if any, is being produced, and that's because sulfate reduction is happening and not methanogenesis. As you move into brackish systems or freshwater systems, you do get more methane production. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the systems aren't still carbon sinks. What it does mean is that if you want to show that they're a carbon sink, for example, if you want to get carbon credits for a wetland restoration project that's in a freshwater tidal wetland or a brackish tidal wetland, you will need to do some additional measuring and accounting. You will need to look at methane production. You will need to look at N2O. Because those are more powerful greenhouse gases, and a smaller amount of production of those can offset the benefits of the carbon being stored in the system. And so it isn't, it basically goes more wetland by wetland as to how big a sink it might be, and it's a little bit more of an important carbon or greenhouse gas accounting question if you want to try and get carbon credits for a project in a different system. But it doesn't necessarily mean those systems are automatically not carbon sinks. They are oftentimes can still be greenhouse gas sinks. You just have to do a little more work to figure that out.
Great, thank you. And this will be the last question. There's a lot more, but we'll get those to you, and we'll make sure we get these questions answered, everyone. But there's a lot of interest in restoration projects around the U.S. and how students can potentially get involved. And do you have any resources or websites you can point people to for that?
Yeah, so I don't really work at the local level or even the state level on individual projects, but a lot of our partners do. And one of the places I would send people probably is Restore America's Estuaries to look for, because they have work in all different estuaries around the country and are often doing some kind of project where they want to recruit or volunteers to come help with the project. So I would check out Restore America's Estuaries webpage, and I also have a link on here for signing up for the Blue Carbon Buzz e-newsletter, which they send out about once a month with good updates about blue carbon. Probably the best place to go for that kind of information is more of a local organization, nonprofit that's focused on wetland restoration, or for example, if you have a National Estuarine Research Reserve, a NERS site, which is a partnership between the states and NOAA, or EPA runs a National Estuaries Program, NEP. You can look up those sites as well, because if you have one of those nearby, I would not be at all surprised if they have projects that students or others can get involved with. But all of that tends to happen at a more localized level, and so I am not as aware of exactly where there's stuff happening at any one time. But I hope that there are projects happening at any time that students could get involved with, because I think it would be a really exciting opportunity for students.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. That was really, really fantastic. And we have a few more slides here. We'll definitely get back to your questions with Ariana. And here, I'm just going to go ahead and put my slide up here. There we go. So if we didn't get to your questions, we'll definitely get back to you. And just wanted to thank everyone for attending the SOURCE webinar today. We welcome any feedback, questions, or suggestions for topics for the webinar series. And you can submit input by replying to the follow-up email that you'll receive, or by emailing us at the emails listed on the slide here. And I'm very excited to announce our next webinar, which will be on May 6th, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. It's actually going to be 8 a.m. in Tasmania, where Jen and I will be. And we're going to be working with Dwight Gledel and Libby Jewett from the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program Office, and Sarah Mae Nelson from Climate Interpreter on discussing some of the results of the Ocean in a High CO2 World Symposium, which is happening May 3rd through 6th in Hobart, Tasmania. And so we're really looking forward to having you participate in that webinar as well. It's hard to get all the time zones to work out, but hopefully you'll be able to join us or at least view the recording. And thanks again, Ariana, for a wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. And this is the end of today's session. Thanks very much.